Welcome to the Whitmercast, a podcast by the John Whitmer Historical Association. We bring you essays, interviews, panel discussions, and broadcasts related to Mormon history and restoration studies. Thank you for tuning in today. My name is Jason Smith, and I'm a student at Chicago Theological Seminary, and I'll be your host for today's episode. And we have a great episode lined up. We'll be talking with Ronald V. Huggins, author of numerous books and articles, including his newest work, Lighthouse, from Signature Books, which tells the story of Jerald and Sandra Tanner. As a special treat, we are also joined by Sandra Tanner, the star of the new book. If you would like to join JWHA or visit our entire backlog of episodes and journals, go to jwha.info. With that out of the way, let's get started. So Sandra, I don't think you need any introduction for most of our listeners. They'll be very familiar with who you are, and your life and work speak for themselves. But Ron, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? How did you start this research?
In terms of the book or in terms of Mormonism, or what do you mean?
Talk about your interest in Mormonism and then in the book specifically.
Okay, well, just very quickly, while I was growing up, there was some rough spots in my family, and there was a Mormon family that pretty much embraced me as sort of a son, really. I mean, there's a large family with an older patriarch and matriarch and several daughters, and then my friend who had been a schoolmate. And, basically I could stay at any of their houses as long as I wanted. It basically just folded me into their family. They were a very rough and ready kind of folk Mormon family. I remember the father one time telling me, if you ever feel the wind coming from the east, the Lord's returning. I mean, and he had displayed his journal of discourses proudly on the mantelpiece, or at least on some kind of bookshelf up there. And so that was my, and of course they were always having the missionaries over to talk to me. And so this was my introduction really to Mormonism. And so later when I became a Christian, I was interested in it just specifically because of this family connection. And then later, I actually got sort of drawn in. I wrote an article during my dissertation. I was working on the Burned Over district in Western New York. And by the way, I mean, I've only done 2 books, this one and another small one, mostly articles. But I did an article for Dialogue on Joseph Smith and Romans 7, because that was the subject of my dissertation, just in that big area in Western New York, the revivals and the various different groups. And so that led eventually, well, it played into my being asked to teach at Salt Lake Theological Seminary in Salt Lake City. And then once you're in Salt Lake City, you're in the Mormons. This is a subject that you're engaged in, just as a matter of fact. And I had read the Tanner's newsletters. I was always intrigued by them because of the contrast between their homemade appearance and the quality of the work. I mean, I had seen other books like Will the Saints Go Marching In and Ed Decker, and I knew that they were not the same quality, even though the production was better. More evangelicals read them and trusted them. I mean, I remember one time in a bookstore, and someone asked for where I was working, a Christian bookstore, and someone brought forward a Decker book. And I said, no, let me try and get you something better than that, because I knew of problems in Decker's work. And I showed it to my boss, and he just said, well, he's the authority, and so I knew, for example, that Ed would take a series of quotes out of the Tanner's shadow and just stick them all together as coming from 1 or 2 authors, when they were how many 5-10 authors you may remember, Sandra. But so Mormonism was there, and I knew the Tanners. I mean, when I went to Salt Lake, we became friends. This is 1999, 2000. Jerald was still living, but he was in decline. He wasn't, he could remember things, but he wasn't in full vigor. And so what happened was, when he died, I wrote 3 articles in the Messenger on Jerald's life. And so then in 2008, I got an email from Gary Bergara and saying, well, would you write this for signature? Actually, he was saying for Smith Pettit, so I wasn't sure it was coming out Smith Pettit or signature at the time. And then he said, well, if you don't write it, we're going to give it to this other scholar and he'll write it. And I knew that the other scholar had an issue with the Tanners, and I'd read his work on the Tanners, and I'd heard him speak on the Tanners. And I knew that he sort of interpreted everything they did with the sinister overlays. So for example, from Pauline Hancock's work that she would always use big letters, caps for her italics and underlines. Same with James Wardle. And so this author was interpreting that as Jerald raging. And it just wasn't that. It was just the fact that you didn't have italics on the manual typewriters, and he was following his mentors, Pauline and James Wardle. And so I agreed to it on the spot back in 2008, kind of thought, what have I got myself into? 50, 60 years of ministry and research and reaction, all the other people coming back at them. And so what happened was I was away for a few years and teaching in Missouri. And after that, I had to decide, where am I going? I thought, well, I got to go back to Salt Lake, because there's no place you could write this biography without being there. First of all, direct access to Sandra, and then the Marriott archives with Wardle's papers and with several of the Tanners and the Young family papers, Brigham Young Jr., Mike Morcourt's papers, who was deeply involved in this, and also the church archives. So we actually came back with that specific intention. Let's go back in 2014 and finish this promised biography that I was supposed to come up with. And so that's the origin of the book.
And how long did you spend? You said you came back in 2014. How many years do you have in this book? Reading it, I can tell that it's a labor of love, that you put a lot of time into it.
That is what it is. It's an act for my friends, making sure that I felt that the story should be told, but I felt that if it was told, it had to be told fairly and even-handedly. And actually put in 4 years writing it. I turned the manuscript in on May 1st, 2018. And so it was essentially, in my view, done then. And then there was haggling over editing over the next 4 years, actually, and delays and various things. COVID certainly contributed to that, but there were other delays. I think it was put on the back burner for a while. More pressing things probably intruded, like Michael Quinn's death, probably kind of reorganized things, and different things that were going on in the church, and different evaluations as to what was important. So plus the original book was twice as long, so they cut it back quite a bit.
What was it like to have your research subject just a phone call or email away, or being able to just go and visit with her?
That was really helpful. And not only that, but the Tanner's files, is that I used to have a little motorbike, and I'd go over there, sometimes several times a week, to try and, because as I'm working, I'm thinking, now Sandra never actually saw the manuscript until it was done, but it was always working on this story, going over to Sandra, getting her take on it. And sometimes she would correct what I was finding in the in the manuscript material and so on. Sometimes it would work the other way. We'd figure out, well, it couldn't happen on that day because that was a Tuesday. And it was wonderful. Of course, one of the disadvantages, which I mentioned in the book, is that Jerald, by the time I started, he was gone. And so that meant that I didn't really have his living voice, and I had to interpret Jerald through Sandra. And then it was a little bit hard to reconstruct how he felt or responded, or his sense of different events, because of course Jerald and Sandra were quite different people. And so, and then also, many of the things that Sandra remembers are the amusing, funny stories or weird, quirky things that Jerald did, because he was certainly an oddball character, an odd duck in some ways. And so that was a challenge, but it was great to have, I mean, couldn't have had a better occasion, a better setting for writing the biography, because number one, I wasn't under anybody's control. Probably Signature's desires were the most dominant thing. I could write what I felt like, and Sandra didn't try and intrude with that. She just helped and remembered and would tell stories. And then I think, oh, that story goes great over here. And unfortunately, by the time I turned in the manuscript, well, even now, all the stories, I'm always still hearing new stories. I heard a new story about Pauline from Sandra yesterday that I'd never heard before. So anyway, that's the story.
Well, Sandra, I really enjoyed the book, and it really presents a very kind of holistic view of your life. I mean, it really talks about the humanity of what you guys went through, your struggles, and it deals with some things that maybe aren't as pleasant to reflect on. You know, Jerald's Alzheimer's and his decline, some of your father's struggles, and some other things that are mentioned in the book. What was it like to be the subject of a book and just lay all your cards out on the table and trust that the story would be told faithfully?
Well, I was very relieved that Ron was the one chosen to do the book because we were so controversial through the years that it was nice to entrust all your papers and open the access to everything to someone that you knew as a friend, but that was intent on being fair. And I never wanted to push Ron in one direction or another. I wanted him to tell it the way he saw it. And I knew he would, that friendship would not stand in the way of truth. And I trusted him to do fairly with some very intimate struggles in our lives. And I think everyone, when they read a biography, wants to feel that the person writing it is looking at both sides and trying to be a fair observer of the events and not trying to sway you to see something from this way or that way. It is a little strange to open your whole life to someone. I let him go through old letters and papers and files that no one else has seen, and but I trusted him with all of that. So I was very pleased with the way it all turned out. There are a few stories that I would have liked to have seen in the book, but when you take a 700-page manuscript and cut it down to, 350 or whatever, you're going to lose some stories. But that's okay. I was happy with the ones that appeared in there, and hopefully people will see that it is an honest effort to look at our career over. I mean, covering 60 years is a big job for anything.
And I can say that his fairness really comes through in his writing. Ron, you did a tremendous job with presenting all aspects of the story that you could, even with some of those figures that the Tanners dealt with that were sensational or questionable characters, like DJ Nelson and some of those. I thought you dealt with that fairly. Ron, what were some of the hurdles or stumbling blocks that you experienced in the research?
Well, one of the things, I guess one of the hurdles was a superabundance of materials and issues, and trying to get the bigger story of things that Jerald and Sandra had been involved in. And at the beginning of the process, and I was kind of telling the people at Signature all along, well, this isn't really, you can't tell the story of the Tanners without telling the story of Mormon history for the last 50 years. And that means every side of the different debates and arguments and the colorful characters and things. And so just at the end, one of the editors over there said, well, I was reading the final manuscript, and this just isn't about the Tanners, it's about Mormon history for the last 50 years or 60 years. I said, well, yeah, but that's what I've been saying all along. So that was that was an impediment. I mentioned trying to figure out kind of how Jerald viewed the world, what his inner life was like, which I think was something that because of his private personality, even's a question sometime for Sandra, because he was very private, very shy, kept things to himself. And I would have liked to talk to him. Choosing stories was a little bit challenging sometimes because there were so many. I mean, there's literally hardly anything that of the major issues, the Book of Abraham, the changing of the Revelations, polygamy, racism, everything that the Tanners had their hand on, I mean, had a hand in, and knew the major players. So, Mark Hoffman would come down to the Tanner store, and so there's stories there. And so there's just trying to balance out just telling the story and putting in all the other figures and like interesting characters and significant people. Another hurdle for me was to keep it nice, because there's characters in the book that just honestly looking at them, especially when I don't know them, it's hard to depict them as in a sympathetic light. It's hard not to view them as an undesirable characters, repellent characters. Joseph Fielding Smith is not the most lovable guy, at least viewed through what he did and wrote. And the same thing with the lawsuit, which was one of the most difficult, the $1 million lawsuit, which I felt was really frivolous, and it seemed like the lawyers were being the worst of what lawyers are known for. And so just working through that chapter was tough, keeping the adjectives that are burbling up like cad, bounder, scoundrel from entering the text. And so that was a thing too, just trying to give everybody a sympathetic reading despite having feelings at certain points.
You both have mentioned, things that you felt were left out of, you said you had to cut it down to about half its size. Sandra, I'll start with you first. What are there any particular stories that you feel like really should have been in the book that didn't make it, that you can think of?
Well, at this point, I'm a little fuzzy on what got cut out of the story. When I went back and looked at some of the earlier stuff of Ron's earlier drafts, I realized that a lot of the stories that are in the book were just told in a much more expanded version, where you had a lot more of the details surrounding different events that were told, and which I find the details very fascinating, and I think they add to the story, and I feel bad some of those details had to be cut out. But I realize most people are not going to read a 700-page book. So I just had to be content with the limited telling of events that I thought would have benefited from a bigger telling of the surrounding events. But any biography suffers from that. I'm sure doing stories of any figure that covers a number of years is going to suffer from not being able to tell all the details of big events that happen. So it's part of the problem of editing.
Ron, what about you?
Well, even though I read through the manuscript the last time, just a few months ago, I keep hitting places where I'm thinking, well, where's that piece, And so I'm not even sure all what's left out of it. And I haven't looked at the full manuscript for a while. So, but one of the things that Sandra mentions is the story of Thomas Ferguson, their interaction with him. He was a Mormon archaeologist who basically came to the conclusion that there was no evidence in South America or Central America for the Book of Mormon, and sort of, I don't recall the whole story now, but that didn't get in, and we would have liked to have seen that in. I would have liked to some of the stories, as Sandra said, they were more filled out. Some I think would have been better served if the fuller story had been told. I think a little bit more background on some of the chapters, like for example, even the Mark Hoffman chapter, I think would have there were some things in there, the bigger picture of his forgery that didn't get in. I understand why it didn't get in, but I would think that just it would have been good to have it in.
What, and this is for both of you. Ron, I'll let you go first. What were some of the most surprising things that you discovered while working on the book? And Sandra, when it comes to you, what were some of the most surprising things that you thought Ron found interesting, that you thought, well, that's just normal life? But Ron, go ahead.
I think one of the things that surprised me a little bit, I knew something of it, but was Jerald's whole person, just that he was who he was. When you don't know the person personally, well, I did know him for the 6 years of his decline, but his narrow focus, his, in a way, very simplicity as a person, his annoying personal following the rules, like you don't cross the street when there's no crosswalk, you have to walk down to the corner. If you get 25 cents in change that doesn't belong to you, you got to go back to the store. These kinds of things. Another thing was, of course, like when I heard that they sponsored, I knew they sponsored World Vision's children, but I had no idea that they sponsored 100 of them. That was just Jerald. And when he was asked to be at the rescue mission just daily for the rest, not every day, but most days of most weeks, he was down at the rescue mission half a day. It was just the other half of his life. And so his single-mindedness certainly was a surprise to me. Because what happens is as you write someone's story, you're sort of trying to use empathy to understand them. And then just coming to terms with the fact that Jerald Tanner is a very unusual person. We even talked about the possibility of there being some level of autism there, Sandra and I don't know whether that would be appropriate or not. But I wouldn't say he had extreme autism, certainly, because I've encountered that. But so that was a surprise to me.
Sandra, what were the surprising aspects of this process for you?
Well, I don't know about surprising, but in digging through all the old stuff helped me to have more understanding of how Jerald ended up the way he did. And some of that was, I believe, in the original manuscript, but things that would explain how Jerald's life developed. Like early on, as a young child, he had severe eye problems. And back before contact lenses in the dark ages, Jerald wore the first kind of contact lenses. And they are the size of a quarter. I have these, I showed them to Ron, but they're the size of a quarter and fit the whole front of the eye. And the doctor had him wearing these big contact lenses because they hoped it would stop the deterioration of his eyesight. Otherwise, his glasses would be like the bottom of Coke bottles, just real thick. And so he was not encouraged to read or to do scholastic material for fear that he would strain his eyes and they would deteriorate further. Now, I don't know if they would have, but that was the family's understanding. And both Jerald and his mother had told me at times about why he wore contacts was not just to get rid of glasses, but that it was presented to them by their eye doctor as a means of hoping to stop his eyes from getting worse. So he was not encouraged to read or do scholastic things. And then he got in high school, he got into magic and magic performances that he'd do at school functions and things. but I guess he viewed it as not using his eyes as strenuously as if you were reading books all the time. Doing the magic shows as a teenager is an interesting problem for him. Why is this very shy, reticent guy doing these stage performances? So I don't know. It was just interesting going back over his life. And then another thing that shaped him was that he had this problem of excessive sweating in his hands, which made him reluctant to shake hands with people. And I think that fed into making him a more private person as well. When we'd go to church, he'd stuff all these handkerchiefs into his pockets. So he would kind of look like a chipmunk with his pockets bulging out, because he'd want to wipe his hands off before he would shake hands. And we always went to a small church, and I didn't think about it at the time, but this all must have played into that. If he went to a big church, there would be much more emotional trauma and being put on the spot, visiting with people, which would mean his hands would shake, would sweat more. So these all, I think, encouraged him in his more reclusive sort of habits of staying away from people. In fact, this led to a situation where Jerald had gone, this before the internet, Jerald had gone to the library and researched why you would have sweaty palms and what you could do about it. He found out there was a doctor in Sweden that did surgery on this. And they did it in the United States, but it was more costly, and insurance companies didn't usually cover it because it was considered elective. But he found this doctor in Sweden, and $6,000 to have this minor surgery done to stop the sweating in the hands. So he had inherited money from his folks. And by the way, that's why we were able to afford for a short time, for a few years, that 100 kids through World Vision was because of his folks' inheritance. But Jerald came to me one day and he says, it's going to cost $6,000 for me to get this surgery on my hands in Sweden. So if I give you $6,000 for a trip to Europe, would you consent to me going and having this surgery on my hands? And for a trip to Europe, sure, I'll okay that one. But it shows the depth of the concern it was for him to be in public and shaking hands with people. And it did help. So there were just different things in Jerald's life that way as we reflected on it and going through it all, that I started putting different pieces together to understand better why he became the recluse. And by then he had figured out that he could read all the books he wanted and it wasn't going to affect his eyes. The eye doctors had moved on and getting smarter through the years. And they said, no, you can read all you want. That opened things up in that regard. So it's all been a journey for me just to fit all the pieces of our lives together and see it as a whole, not just little incidences.
If I can add one thing that did surprise me. Well, first of all, I wish they had that section. I thought that section of the trip to Europe was a significant one, which didn't get in. But one of the things that did surprise me was how many of the issues that were dominating Mormon studies during the years that I taught here, especially in other words, after 2000, were already issues that Sandra and Jerald and their circle, including Pauline and Wardle, were working on back in the 50s. So this is, that was interesting to me. And some of the solutions, like dealing with modalistic language in the Book of Mormon, the idea that there's only one God somehow expressed in three persons, which is to the right of Orthodox Trinitarianism, whereas current plurality of God's doctrine is more to the left of Trinitarian theology. So that Mormonism took this huge swing, or Joseph Smith, from a very monotheistic to the exclusion of the idea of the Trinity almost, over to a plurality of gods. And the way that Pauline, which you probably researched yourself, Pauline and Jerald and others struggled with the first vision story with the two personages, tried to make sense of that. And just all the issues that became really common knowledge after 2000 had already been treated and were being treated so much earlier. That surprised me. And it's the story of the book too. So,
Well, and you mentioned again Pauline Hancock and James Wardle, and I had tried to warn Sandra that I probably will ask about those two characters because they intrigue me so much. Sandra, can you tell us a little bit about the influence of those two people and this early time in your marriage and in your ministry where you still believe the Book of Mormon, you still believed in Joseph's gift to translate the Book of Mormon, and maybe your baptism and conversion experience?
My family's connection with Pauline Hancock goes back before I knew about it. My mother had read Brody, and so had one of my aunts and my grandma back in the 50s. And so they had started studying, visiting used bookstores on trips to Salt Lake. They would visit used bookstores and things. Somehow or another, my mother came across James Wardle's barbershop. Some way my grandma got in touch with James and had got on some sort of list James had figured out of people interested in Mormonism in the area. And so she becomes the channel through which I meet Jerald, because when Jerald starts studying Mormonism, he finds James Wardle's barbershop. And through James, he finds out about Pauline Hancock's church. And through James, he does research into the breakoff groups, and he goes back to Missouri, meets Pauline and her church, travels twice there and gets baptized by them. And then he's back in Salt Lake. Jerald decides to start some sort of little cottage meetings at his folks' house and asked James for a list of possible people that would be interested. And so that's how my grandma got a notice about this meeting that she asked me to drive her to. And that's when I connect with Jerald and the little church in Missouri. But my mom had already done this before I met Jerald. She had been in contact with Pauline Hancock and written a few letters back and forth. So when I got engaged to Jerald, my mother was not pleased because she already knew about Pauline's church, and she felt they were an extreme splinter group and was not wanting me involved and fought against it and hoped that, well, she'd rather have me be a Mormon than be in Pauline's church. She'd rather I was nothing, but it would be better to be Mormon than in this little splinter group. So the whole story includes many of the same people in different stages of our journey through Mormonism. So it's been odd to go back and see all the threads that connect, like that my mother was already aware of James and Pauline before I even met Jerald.
Ron, do you have anything to add about this?
well, I mean, you mentioned Sandra's actual conversion, and she didn't mention that. So did you want to talk about that, Sandra?
Oh, okay. So when I meet Jerald, he's playing tapes of Pauline's and from the little group in Missouri, trying to help me see that Utah Mormonism is not God's plan, that the Book of Mormon doesn't teach Utah Mormonism, and that I needed to reject all of this and just follow Christ using the Bible and Book of Mormon. But he could see that I was struggling with putting the pieces together, just him and me talking about these things. So he asked me after we got married, a couple months later, he asked if I would be willing to go back to Independence, Missouri and meet the group back there. He felt this would help me understand the spiritual nature of what he was talking to me about, not just facts, but to experience what it means to be with people that really put Christ first in their lives. So I went on the train alone back to Independence, Missouri. I had just become pregnant, so I was having morning sickness every day, which made the trip less than enjoyable. But meeting Pauline and the group there was transforming. I hadn't been around people that centered their lives that much about Christ. And to go to prayer meeting with them was so impactful. They're in their basement church, they had theater seats. And when they'd have prayer time, we'd all kneel at those fold up theater seats and pray. And when they prayed, they all prayed at the same time vocally. And so you just hear these voices all across the room, lifting their hearts to God in petition. No one paying attention to the person next to them, what they were saying, each one just seeking God like no one else was in the room. But kneeling there, listening to the different people pray, you could see the genuineness of their worship. And it was an approach to God that I'd never experienced in Mormonism. It was so personal and real and non-pretentious. They weren't praying for anybody else to hear. So it really impacted me to meet with these people that love God in such a centralized part of their life. Through that, I started to have a deeper desire to follow God like they were doing. And when I got back home, Jerald's taking me to different Christian churches in California. I was having a hard time with the idea of grace and works. I think most Utah Mormons do, probably others as well. But I mean, in Mormonism, in Utah, it's especially hard because there is such emphasis on performance as part of what makes you right with God. You have to perform all the rituals of Mormonism to have a right standing. And these people were all just focused on your relationship to God and working out through your life, a life honoring to God. But the honoring to God didn't make you more saved. It brought you into closer relationship to God. So going to these different churches, trying to figure out what's the difference between what Joseph Smith did and what the Bible says, and the Book of Mormon for that matter. Listening to a Christian radio station one day, the minister came on preaching from 1 John chapter 4. Herein is love, not that we loved God, but that he loved us and gave his son as a propitiation for us. And as the minister went through and explained this portion, it finally was like turning the lens on a magnifying glass or on a telescope or something to bring it into focus, that I put those together and figured out what they were all meaning, that coming to Christ was not signing up for a list of do's and don'ts or achievements. It was throwing yourself on the mercy of Christ, that I should be impressed by the wonder that God loved me first and reached out to me. And in Mormonism, you didn't have that God to me emphasis. It was my effort towards God, which made it much more of the personal effort than God's reaching out. So it was through that radio program that I accepted Christ as my Savior. But Jerald and I still believed the Book of Mormon, both as young Christians trying to convince the world that what they needed to do was throw out all of Mormonism, just keep the Bible and Book of Mormon. And then over the next few years, we were challenged on the Book of Mormon part until finally we set the Book of Mormon aside as well. And that would have been in the fall of 1962. So we got married in 59. By the fall of 62, we had given up the Book of Mormon. So in the winter, the start of 63, we started looking around for a regular Christian church in our area. And that's when we started attending the Christian Missionary Alliance, which would be an evangelical Christian church, somewhat close to maybe a combination of Nazarene and Pentecostal, I don't know. So that's how we ended up there. Did that answer what you were asking?
Yes, thank you. I want to ask about a couple of other individuals that Mike Marquardt that comes through periodically in the book, and I know our John Whitmer Historical Association listeners are very familiar with Mike. I was wondering, Ron, if you could tell us about how helpful his papers were in the research, and did you talk to him about some of the research too?
Yes, they were extremely helpful. I think Mike's papers are the most asked for at the Marriott Library. At least I've heard that. For a long time, they just kept them right there on the floor, so anybody asked for them. His papers are so comprehensive that I think there's, well, I don't even know how many boxes. I probably lost track at 96. But so yes, I talked to him several times. I talked to him, because like you, he was interested in Pauline Hancock and knew Pauline Hancock, had been back to her church. And by the way, your contribution on Pauline Hancock was pretty foundational for my being able to get a handle on her too. I'd hoped to kind of fill out some of the details, but I think that was an important work. Mike was, he came into the story so often that I needed to contact him quite regularly, and he was always very expansive in offering recollections. One time he'd been called in on the question whether he was supportive on polygamy, and that's in the book. And so he told me that story and pointed me to the documents. He had experience with Mark Hoffman. So Mike is a major source of the biography. Mike also knew the Tanners. It's a funny story I didn't get in the book about how Mike got in touch with Wes Walters first time. And where he just sort of showed up in the middle of the night on Easter morning, calls Wes, "I'm here," and then and then that was the beginning of a long career. One of the things I don't know if people know is Wes. Did you know Wes Walters?
I didn't.
Well, Wes was given some additional money to pursue his Mormon ministry to Mormons, which was a special area of interest to him. And so he used the money to buy a couple of little Apple computers to give to people who he thought would be promising and who would probably be effective in the unfolding study of Mormon history. And so one of the people he gave a computer to was Dan Vogel, and the other to Mike Morcourt. And I always was impressed by that, because there couldn't have been a wiser investment than giving those two guys computers.
Yeah.
I remember when the first vision, when the account of the 1832 account of the first vision partly in Joseph's own hand, was just becoming available. And Mike was eager to reprint Joseph's early diaries. It wasn't actually in a diary. The church, I think who was it? Dean Jesse, I think, who was doing the diary, the early diary, and he was saying, "Oh well, it'll be years before we can get this thing done." And here Mike was collecting pictures. If there was a newspaper article, somebody showed the diary, he took he got the picture and was transcribing. So there's big sheafs of Mike's work, and Mike could have got it done for you in a month. But as it happened, he had to do it bit by bit, and he ended up publishing the diaries first and through the Tanners. So yeah, Mike is a big player and a big source, both his papers and another thing, Lamar Peterson's papers, James Wardle's papers are also pretty extensive and were very helpful.
And I want to ask you about one more character that is mentioned in the book, is kind of infamous in Mormonism, and that's Ed Decker. And this is, both of you can answer this question. I'll start with Sandra. What do you think sets your ministry apart from other ministries like Ed Decker's Saints Alive ministry, as far as your approach and your methodology?
Well, Jerald was always more careful. One of the problems we had when we were first doubting and researching was we saw this problem in what there was of critical material against Mormonism, that much of the material that came from these different small Christian efforts to put out tracts or pamphlets or whatever was, for one thing, they all were addressed to Christians, not to Mormons. And so it's a little different argument, because to the Christian, all you have to tell them is Joseph taught plural gods, and the Christian's going to be through with Mormonism. To a Mormon, to talk about plural gods, they're like, okay, yeah, sounds good to me, So the directions were different. We were looking for something written for Mormons, but then the problem was those that were written to the Mormons often had mistakes in them, where they weren't careful with the references. And this was true of Walter Martin, who was just coming on the scene in the 60s. And there would be a statement made that was maybe an accurate quote, but not careful to get the right reference. So, or exaggerate something that when you went and looked it up wasn't quite as sensational as they made it sound. So early on, Jerald wanted to make sure that no one could come back at us by saying, you didn't look up the reference. You didn't see that quote someone was using was out of context, or was misused, or misrepresented, or mistyped, or misidentified. And we found it discouraging when we came across those things. So we wanted to make sure they weren't in what we put out. We wanted it so that a Mormon went and looked up our sources and couldn't come back and say, you misrepresented that, you lied, or you invented that. We wanted the references to be accurate. And I found, unfortunately, with some of the critical Christian groups springing up through the 60s, 70s, 80s, there wasn't always the same commitment to make sure something was accurate. There was too much of a willingness to just accept some statement by somebody without checking it out, without looking for references. And I found that very discouraging, because once a Mormon hits an error like that in the writings, they dismiss all the people who are critical of Mormonism. We didn't want to add to the problem. We were trying to solve problems, not create more.
Ron, the same question to you. What do you think makes the Tanners and the Utah Lighthouse Ministry stand out from other ministries and critics of Mormonism?
I mean, one of the, certainly Sandra's is the central issue. The thing that made him stand out for me, well, the first time I think I became aware of Ed Decker was back in 1980, when I think 1980 was when the Godmakers came out. And I was living in Idaho and working at a Christian bookstore. And we had, of course, Decker's books and others. And the Godmakers had come to town, and it made a big splash. I mean, they played it at the university, and there was lots of people there, and there was lots of Mormon missionaries bearing their testimony and doing all that. And yet, so it was a puzzle for me. Here's these people who I knew were careless. I mean, I knew Ed was careless, and I didn't like it, because I felt like Sandra does it, if it's important enough to do, it's important enough to do well. And so there was a sensationalism. That's another issue. The Tanners aren't sensational. Basically, they lay out their research, and that's what you get. And again, it's more focused on communicating with Mormons. Many of, because of my connections in the past with this Mormon family, I didn't find snide, cocky, and inaccurate information presented about Mormons amusing. I didn't find it helpful. And when it was erroneous, when it was false, I found it less than helpful. And having also this background when there was the period, especially during the earlier 2000s, where many Mormon leaders were sort of trying to deny basic Mormon teachings, like Lorenzo Snow's couplet, or at least cast a shadow of doubt over them. I also knew that wasn't true, and I knew that Christians who were trying to make inroads with communicating with Mormons on that route, that wasn't going to be a long-term solution either, just sort of pretending that the church never taught what it definitely taught. better to just admit what it taught and deal with that. So in all of that, it seemed like the Tanners were a stable continuum through all those years where, many Christian books I felt that were written about Mormonism for Christians were more for scandalizing Christians and titillating them than they were for helping anybody or bringing out truth. One of the things that was difficult in the book was, for me, was even still as an evangelical, I hesitate to, Walter Martin and Ed Decker are my guys, and yet I give them a pretty hard time in the book. And I hope that's kind of in the tradition of the Tanners, because they were clearly in the wrong at certain points. And I expected, or at least I foresaw the possibility that the publishing it with signature might be viewed as a betrayal. Some of my friends hold Tanner and Decker in the highest esteem. Not Tanner, I'm sorry, Walter Martin. And of course, I had read Walter Martin early on, and I didn't know about the problems. Actually, I didn't know about some of the problems until I was doing the research for the book. Just factual problems and procedural problems that led to endorsement of the Lucifer God doctrine, the idea that in the temple, when they said Pele Ale, they were saying, what is it, marvelous Lucifer or something like that. What was the actual phrase? I can't remember.
Oh, wonderful Lucifer.
Right, oh, wonderful Lucifer, and seeing that whole story. And the first edit, which wasn't done in-house, played down some of the critical comments of people like Joseph Fielding Smith. And to try and, it provided butt cover for LDS leaders, but left Walter Martin and Ed Decker and people that I was critical there, left them, of course, intact, the criticisms there. And I said, come on, guys, if your guys are being jerks, I've already talked about my guys being jerks. You have to, be even-handed, you can't sort of paper over Joseph Fielding Smith's racial statements, things like that. And once we got over that bump, and I don't know who they got to edit the first edit, but I've heard that they even think that it was a non-Mormon, but in any case, it was someone with hostility toward the Tanners that worked through the whole first draft. And so ultimately we got a better balance with Joseph Fielding Smith and his, all warts and all, and with Walter Martin warts and all, and Ed Decker.
Well, I can say, as someone who's read the book and knows the reputation of the Tanners, the theme of the book to me seems to be this real dedication to the truth. When you guys had published things unknowingly that weren't true, you remedied that. You called out others that would have been things that would have been helpful to your side, to your argument, but they weren't true, and you guys called them out on that. What for both of you, what do you think is the primary takeaway that you want people to have of this book when they read it, besides that dedication to the truth, which I think is a strong theme throughout?
Well, I would hope that they would have a better appreciation of the struggle to get the actual history of early Mormonism told. That I hear different people today talking about church history as though it all just started going and getting discovered after the 1980s time period. And I'd say, no, we were writing on first vision problems in the 60s. And so I think it gives you a better feeling for the progression of historical research in Mormonism over those 60 years, that it started earlier than a lot of the people today realize, and that it was much more of a struggle, that the church was hiding history very effectively in the 60s and 70s and 80s, certainly the Mormon Church has gotten more open today, and they do publish more of their history. And that's a good direction, but they have not fully got to the point of telling their story in a non-varnished way. They still hold back on certain topics and certain diaries. But our book shows the struggle of the last 60 years for everyone, not just for us, but that it was the pattern of Mormonism to hide its history, to distort the history, to make it a faith-promoting story. And I think the book shows the evolution of Mormonism's handling of their past and how they've been forced to be more honest and straightforward with it.
Ron, how about you?
Well, one thing I think is the thrust of the book, which I'd hoped it would be. I mean, the issue of God is a key issue in the Tanner's life, and trying to find God and trying to find first the true church and then moving beyond that idea and finding Jesus. But one of the things you'll notice, and this is not only in Mormonism, but people who depart from the religion or the views of their background generally tend to just jump over to the other side. So someone described, if you scratch the paint on a theological liberal, you'll find a disgruntled fundamentalist under the paint. And that's really true. So what you have in Mormonism, you have people, they begin to see problems with the way the church has been handling history. Very often the problems are greater for them to be lied to about that history than the problems of the history itself. And then they leap over, immediately they give up the whole thing and go over and join a camp of atheists or people who are just hypercritical of Mormonism. And without really thinking about the fact that the question of God and our relationship with God is a universal question. It's not something tied particularly to the Book of Mormon. And so, for example, if some little group comes along with some holy book like the Shakers had, and that turns out not to be true, that doesn't mean that the obvious answer is that God isn't there. It's just simply that they were waylaid. And I think the Tanners modeled the commitment to truth, modeled the way to approach that whole question. And Jerald and Sandra had enough independence as individuals to not to do the leap. I mean, there are all the time you see, I have friends who jump from one thing to another and try and get me to jump with them. So they'll see the problems in evangelicalism or Southern Baptist, and then they'll jump over and become Eastern Orthodox. Or they'll see the problems in Catholicism and jump way over and become something else. And rather than work their way from wherever they were to wherever they end up. And I think, and it's almost a group thing. You see it happen politically too. People leap from Republican to Democrat or from Democrat to Republican and aren't able to say, well, I can go this far with you, but not further. So when Jerald's reaction to John Whitmer's tract first was a natural one, throwing it down, but then working through the issues until he first of all looking for the real true church, and then finding that it really wasn't about the real true church, it was about God. I think that's a thrust in the book that I'd like to come through. I wouldn't like to lose, on the one hand, it's a history of research and of struggles in that terms. And on the other hand, it's the description of two people finding their way to God and trying to be faithful to God. And there's no way that you can really take them apart. And so that's my answer.
Are there, besides Mark Wart you mentioned, are there any other collaborators or especially helpful people that really assisted in your research that you want to give a shout out to?
Yeah, I mean, there's many people that in the introduction there, I mentioned several people. The Mormon history page was a great place because if I needed to get, say, Brent Metcalf's recollections or his thoughts on a particular subject, he was always helpful. Also, Chris Velakos, who was in Utah at the time, who now teaches at Wheaton College. Chris and I go way back, and Chris, and I think he was the one who introduced me to the Tanners were back around 1980, and he'd written an article for Moody Monthly magazine about them. So he was always ready to give me his recollections. Let me think of other people. The question, I'll probably forget to mention people, so I would recommend looking at the introduction. But Shannon Flynn was helpful in certain answering questions. Michael Quinn helped a little. I don't feel that he was sympathetic towards the project, but he did help in a couple of places. I don't know that he was very happy about helping, but so I talked to Kurt Bench about some of his recollections with the Mark Hoffman thing, Ann Wild, who Ogden Kraut's polygamous wife, about the polygamy issue. Just really a lot of people. And one of the issues is that and Dan Vogel, of course, is always helpful either in his work. So, I mean, I already knew so many of these people. So and I'd write emails, and I don't recall how many directly contributed to the book, but certainly much more than is in the current book. That's one of the reasons I wanted to be out here, even though I can access things online. Brent, though, was a great help with the handwriting issues in terms of the Spalding theory, which is the idea that the Book of Mormon was written by Solomon Spalding. And also he was helpful with the Book of Abraham stuff. So those are a few people that were helpful to me.
Are there anything that we didn't talk about that you either of you feel is important to the project that you want to mention?
Well, I don't think of anything right off. Seems like we covered quite a bit.
Yeah, as soon as we go off the air, I'll think of something.
Yeah.
If people want to get in touch with you, you want to talk about how to get their hands on the book, and also Sandra, if you want to talk about the ministry, how to contact you. Go ahead, Ron.
Well, the book's available on Amazon, or you can order it from utlm.org, which is Sandra's Utah Lighthouse Ministry.org, UTLM. And you can order it there. And you can get signed copies if you want signed copies. Sandra and I signed both of them. Both of us signed them. Hardback just finally came out day before yesterday, after it was supposed to be out in July. And there was a delay, so now it's available too. And paperback and Kindle's very cheap. It's $8.99, I think, or for the book. That's what I bought. I haven't actually seen my copies yet, but anything to add, Sandra?
I don't remember now what all the question was, other than the availability of the book. And yes, it's for sale on our website. Also on our website are our past newsletters, and it would have the 3 newsletters that Ron wrote years back on Jerald's and my beginning relationship and how we met Pauline and went to her church and all that. So, which is a little more detailed than came out in the book. So if you want more on that early aspect of our start out of Mormonism, look up the 3 newsletters on our website at utlm.org. And there's all kind of information there besides ordering books.
Well, I want to thank you both again for coming and joining me today. It's been a very interesting discussion for me, and I think that others will find it helpful too. We want to thank you for tuning in to the Whitmercast. The John Whitmer Historical Association is an educational nonprofit institution. For more information, visit jwha.info, where you can meet our team and join the association, read past issues of the JWHA Journal, and get updates on upcoming conferences and events. Our theme music is I Love to Tell the Story, composed by Tom Moraine. This podcast is a production of John Whitmer Historical Association. Copyright August 2022. All rights reserved.